Hey, what's up everybody? We're back in Modeler, and today I want to show you something very cool, and that is kitbashing. Now, what is kitbashing, some of you may ask? Well, if you take a look at the video, it's pretty self-explanatory, but it's taking a bunch of 3D pieces and assembling them together to create something. For this specific project, I made my own library of pieces, but it would work just as well if you bought a kit from somebody else online or you make your own pieces. The advantage of making your own pieces is that nobody else's work will look like this. Now I can already hear you in the background saying, McNuggets, where can I get your pieces and use those because they look pretty cool? Well, don't worry, I got you covered. I'm gonna link everything in the description. I made this set with a very specific purpose in mind, and that was to kitbash in VR, in Modeler, because most of the set that you can find online are made for other programs like Blender, and they don't import super well in Modeler, so I wanted to make something that was made for Modeler and in Modeler. It's kind of specific to my needs, but I'm sure that a lot of people will have a ton of fun playing with those. I wanted to make a set that was flexible and that a lot of parts could be reused and modified, stretched and cut and all that stuff, but also include a ton of joints that I reuse all the time and a bunch of surface details and parts that make assembling a mech much faster. But most of all, I wanted to make something that was fun to play with, and you can just be, a little kid playing with robot parts and just assembling whatever you can think of. There's no real trick to kitbashing, but I'm gonna try to walk you through my process and how I usually approach it. Now, first of all, the best way to get better at this is to build actual model kits. So if you never build one, I highly suggest you pause the video, you go on Amazon and you order the cheapest kit you can find and you just build it. Or, get a perfect grade box and then take a week to build it. I swear it's gonna be 100% worth it because you'll understand why I made those parts and how they connect together. You'll recognize the shapes of certain of these joints, and you'll understand better how to put a mech together because you're actually putting a mech together. You have a whole instruction manual that takes you through the whole process step by step. Now, when it comes to VR kitbashing, you have basically unlimited freedom because you can make your own pieces and assemble them in any way you want. When I approach a mech design like this, I try to first start with a skeleton or a base, some type of frame where I can attach all of my pieces. I usually start by making a torso and then start attaching limbs to it. There's a ton of different ways to do this, and there's another way I would like to show you guys in the future where you start with a very loose sketch and then you kitbash on top of that. But for this, I'm using the pieces as is and using those pieces for blocking in. I also add some sketchy volumes just to give me an idea of where I want to block stuff out. But for the most part, I'm just taking stuff and bashing it together. And I'm really not afraid of destroying those pieces and manipulating them to fit my own needs. I don't want to get too attached to my kitbash pieces that I'm careful of not breaking them. I really want to break them and distort them to make a new interesting design. For example, the piece that you see right here, I'm making a leg, but I'm not afraid to chop at it to just put a joint there to be able to attach it to the hip. I still make sure things are intersecting in a nice way and that we don't see some crazy clipping, but at the same time I'm not trying to be perfect. This is still exploration and it's still in a loose stage that we're gonna polish later on. So you can see me assembling a skeleton out of the dark gray material and then starting to put a shell on top of it and sort of making some protection for the underneath moving parts. I'm doing the exact same thing when I'm not kitbashing, but because I don't have to start from scratch every time I'm making a piece, this is just much faster. You see me try a bunch of different things and to see what works. If there's a piece that I don't like the look of, I'm not afraid to just get rid of it, try to replace it, or try to modify it to suit my needs. For example, this knee pad I'm doing right now, it doesn't make it to the final mech. I try some stuff and it ends up not working, so I just get rid of it and then trying to figure out a different solution to the knee pad. The whole process of sculpting this mech took me about 2 hours, and we end up with something that looks quite finished, but we still have a ton of possibility to push it much further and get something super polished and really detailed. When it comes to that type of work, there's really no end to how far you can push stuff. It's just a matter of how much time you're willing to spend on it. Once I have a good first pass at my skeleton and my shell, I start to place joints to be able to assemble all the different parts together. So right now I'm placing an ankle joint to be able to put my foot in, and a wrist joint to be able to put my hand in. And I keep building shell where I feel that it needs more protection and that stuff is too exposed. I'm trying to get a good balance of the dark material to the light material. You've probably heard of the 70-30 rule. That's kind of what I'm aiming for here. A good ratio of skeleton to armor. I often use the split tool to add more complexity to parts, indicate some bolts, and add more general detail. I try to focus the detail around the edges and at the junction in between two pieces. I rarely start putting detail just in the middle of something. Establishing a ground plane or something for our character to stand on is super important. You can use the square brush and just use the angle snap and snap it to the floor so it's nice and leveled. Then I start to group everything together to make sure it's repeated properly, and I try to get a nice stance on the ground. This part is a bit finicky, but I would rather do this in VR than any other traditional 3D software any day. It's so much easier. It actually feels like you're playing with a toy. Here I start to figure out the head. So I grab an eyeball and I grab a big old fin and I try to make something happen. You can see me struggle a bit here with the symmetry, but we fix that later on. I just accept that the one piece is not symmetrical for a while and I work on it even if I know if it's not straight. Don't bother too much about things being perfect and aligned and straight together. It doesn't matter. It won't make your design good. It's your 3D brain that's talking and that's trying to control everything, but you have to embrace the fact that stuff is going to be messed up. The same way that drawing something perfectly, like a photo, doesn't make it interesting in itself. We're kind of trying to get imperfections in our 3D so it doesn't look fake. And here's a good example of transforming a piece so that it makes something very different. Try to adapt the piece to make what I want and not be controlled by the Kitbash piece. Doing the head is a whole thing in itself. It probably deserves its own video on how to make helmets and robot heads. You can probably spend as much time working on the whole mech as you do just on the face because it's the whole personality of your character. I'm not super satisfied with how it came out, but it's okay. We adapt, we move on, and the next one's gonna be better, hopefully. I duplicate pieces from the head to get more volume and start trimming those up so I get some nicer shapes. Again, here trying to get a good balance of light and dark shapes. I'm detailing the face a bit, but not too much. I don't want one area that has a lot of details so that it doesn't look out of place with the rest. I try to detail everything to a similar kind of level. And here I finally decide to get rid of that piece that was slightly off axis and just grab a new one, well, the same one, and place it in the correct group so that it's mirrored properly. But you can see that it doesn't make a huge difference. Brain kinda accepted that the other one was symmetrical enough. You can get away with a lot more crooked stuff that you think of. Now I'm trying to see how much volume I want to give to the torso. And sometimes it's easier to just scribble something in rather than to go grab a new piece that doesn't exactly fit. I can get much more control if I just draw the piece that I want to make. I don't have to kitbash the whole mech. There's no rules to this. You can work however you want. And now for the legs, same as I did with the arms, I'm just adding more armor. Trying to make some cool shapes and indicating some details, making little cuts. Moving stuff around and then placing bolts. And that knee pad didn't make any sense, so I just got rid of it and cleaned it up real quick. And then stretching some stuff with the warp tool. Since everything is grouped and mirrored properly, it's super easy. And then I cut into it to get some more detail, trying to make it different from the original Kitbash piece. Every time I make a cut or I add a little tick mark, I try to get a good ratio of how I'm splitting the form. I'm mindful of where I place my detail, I just don't spam stuff everywhere. And if you don't know where to place your detail, well, just pull up a ref and look at it, and then place the detail in the same spot that they do. Everything is already figured out for you. Somebody has already made something cooler that you could ever make. So just find the right ref and use it properly. And then if you do this enough, at some point you'll be able to place your detail where it feels natural to you and where you think it looks good. And if you've developed enough of a good eye, your design might actually be cooler than anything that's been done before. I added some small parts in the Kitbash set to be able to make smaller details too, not just blocking out big forms, but indicating a lot of stuff really quick. You kind of have to be careful though, because if you do overuse small elements or extra noisy stuff, it gets really overcrowded really fast. So you do have to control how much stuff you put in. I also made a bunch of cylindrical elements like piston tubes, this weird Evangelion entry plug thing. I'm trying to duplicate cool shapes that I already have on my mech so I can kind of have a uniform shape language. But I'm also distorting it enough so that it's not just the same piece copied everywhere. At this point we're past just the blocking phase and we're adding secondary shapes to our design. Try to echo what's going on with the helmet on the torso as well. careful with your move tool. If you don't select the thing properly, you can warp your entire sculpt. And wherever there's a shape or an intersection I don't like, I just chop it off. I play with both colors to make sure I get a good ratio. And at some point I'm gonna start adding a tertiary color and then a tertiary amount of detail as well. Let me know in the comments if the pacing is good for you guys. To me, I find it a little bit slow, so I'm gonna start cranking up the speed on the sculpt just a little bit. Now that I'm happy with the overall shape of my arm and forearm, I start to figure out the actual joints that are linking both of them together. That's where all of my Gundam building kit knowledge comes into play. I know what type of joints I can use and how they will move, so I try to mimic the movement that would happen in my own arm. I often add protection around the elbows, knees, ankles, and shoulders. Every big joint in the body on a robot feels like it needs to be protected. I kind of step away from the Kitbash pieces to just make exactly the shape that I want, but I could start detailing with, more parts that I pull from the set. But if there's no pieces in the set that look exactly like what you need, making one from scratch is sometimes faster than trying to make something fit that wouldn't fit there. When trying to choose a piece from your Kitbash set, find something that resonates with you and that sparks ideas in your brain on where to place it and how you can use that piece to make something different. I don't play with copying and instancing a lot on this build, but you can imagine the amount of complexity that we could get if we start to duplicate a ton of stuff and make repetitive patterns. Once I'm happy with the amount of detail that I have on my arm, I start to attach everything together, so the shoulder pad to the upper arm, and then I put a socket to be able to fit the arm inside of the torso. I'm trying to figure out every joint properly to make sure it would move well. I wanted to show you guys that you can get really technical with that stuff and really precise with your joints, because often in my own sculpt I go quite sketchy and I don't figure out everything, but that's just because I'm a little bit lazy. For me, it requires more brain power to figure out actual mechanics of something than just to make cool random bits. I finally add a third color. I stay quite loose with the placement at first just to get an idea as fast as I can. But again, once I'm happy with the placement of this tertiary color, I clean stuff up. This whole process is pretty fluid, so you can go back and forth between the sketchiness and the cleaning up. Don't feel pressure to follow everything step by step. You kind of have to adapt to what the sculpt is telling you. Then last little block in a shell on the foot before we go to the more detailed phase. I took a little break and then I come back and I start to clean up my orange shapes. I use the warp tool to kind of make a bevel. And then I make sure everything is attached properly with joints. At this point, I'm getting a bit tired of figuring out everything super tight, so I'm kind of indicating more stuff. I'm bouncing in between my 3 colors to make sure I have a good ratio again. And then I start bringing out more smaller detailed piece from the set. I try to bring in some material variation without having some crazy contrasty color. I still keep the gray, but I make it more of a metal piece. And then I make sure the joint in the arm is tight as well. There's a lot of little slight tweaking that happens here. And then I bring in this cool little exhaust detail and I'm starting to place it all over to see where it would kind of fit. I let the design dictates where I'm placing the details. But I also try to think about function and where I would need to place boosters on a mech to make it go faster or fly. I'm not an aerospace engineer, but I try to fake it as best as I can. Adding some little flaps over the boosters and attaching them to the leg. And then adding some cool surface detail on the legs. I try to break from the super square visual language that we have and I start incorporating a bit more rounder shapes just to balance it out. I still want the majority of my design to read as blocky and angular. But the same way I'm dividing my colors in between light and dark in a certain proportion, or my details into big and small in a certain proportion, I do the same thing with the shapes themselves, being square and round. And I finally start to bring in tertiary details, stuff that is way smaller than everything else, and I start to apply them on my surface. At this point, it is only surface detail and I'm not changing the geometry of stuff in a major way. I'm pretty happy with how everything looks and I'm just adding to it so that it's complementing the shapes that are already there and that I already like. At this stage, if you're happy with your design, this is just icing on the cake. You're just adding little bells and whistles to everything. Your design should be already figured out, and most of the time any details that you add here, they won't really screw up your whole design. You definitely can get over detailed and add too much stuff, but the complex parts of your design should be figured out. These little cylinders on the shoulders, they have the pretty much perfect ratio of white to gray to orange that I'm trying to convey in my whole design. I add some last little touches on the face, trying to bring as much personality into my mech as I can. This is a pretty tricky thing to do, to give personality to something that is only metal. But since your brain is kind of hardwired to see faces and stuff, you just start making shapes and something is gonna kind of magically appear and if you see something that you like, you can capitalize on that. Wherever I see surfaces that are too big with no interruption, I break them off in smaller pieces so that it feels like it's assembled from multiple parts. I add a little bunch of these little tick marks and details, little cuts, but around the edges of stuff, because I just created new edges by splitting up those pieces. Some more protection around the ankles. Last little bit of detail coming in with some bolts and screws. And that pretty much wraps it up. Thanks for sticking by all the way up to the end. Hopefully this was informative but also entertaining. I know there was a lot of theory in this one, but I've been wanting to get a little bit more technical with the process and explain everything in detail so you have a good idea of how I approach a complex mech design. We can still push this one much further, but in the amount of time that I spent to make it, I think it's pretty fleshed out and tight. This whole thing was made in 3 sessions of 40 minutes with breaks in between, so about 2 hours total. I hope I got you guys excited about this technique and that you feel inspired to go out there and make your own Kitbash thing. There's a ton of people on the internet with super great Kitbash sets that you can get. My favorite would probably be the iconic Vitaly Bulgarov Black Phoenix set, but just find one that resonates with you or make your own and start creating with it. As always, have fun sculpting in VR and see you next time. Cheers.